The Neuroscience of Intelligence by Professor Richard J. Heyer, one of my personal heroes. And this man was the man who got me into the fascinating world of intelligence. Hi, and welcome to my channel. My name is Dr. Roy Yosevich, and in this channel, I host and interview the most interesting, influential people from all around the world to discuss science, religion, productivity, and intelligence. And today's guest, I'm really, really thrilled and honored to have on the show Professor Richard J. Heyer. Professor Richard Heyer is, and I wrote it, is a Professor Emeritus at the Pediatric Neurobiology Division of School of Medicine at University of California. He has a PhD for Johns Hopkins University, and he is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Intelligence since 2016. And is also the author of the book, The Neuroscience of Intelligence, and the host or the presenter of the fabulous course, The Intelligent Brain from the Great Courses. This is a great course. So Professor Heyer, thank you so much for coming. How are you?
Well, I'm fine. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Okay,
I must tell you, 1 week ago, we have Dr. Russell Warren, and your name came up a lot. So
I know him. He's just written a very interesting book.
Yes. So let me start. Because you're the editor-in-chief of Intelligence, which is the journal that speaks about intelligence. I was informed like 2 weeks ago that Stefan Molyneux, the radio host, was banned from YouTube, partly because he was, and I quote, obsessed with IQ. So Stefan Molyneux was banned from YouTube, Patreon, PayPal, everything. And my question is IQ research flourish these days, or you also feel the heavy end of the PC movement?
Well, all intelligence researchers find it an uphill struggle sometimes to tell the public about the research advances about intelligence. For decades, there's been a feeling or a belief that intelligence research is inherently unfair. And this comes from findings about average group differences, which is a tiny part of intelligence research, just a tiny part. And over the last couple of decades, intelligence research has moved much more toward neuroscience, and it's a very fascinating story. So most intelligence researchers who focus on psychometrics and neuroscience, they're happy to do that work, and most of them try, whenever an opportunity arises, to explain to people who don't know about research just the very basics, that intelligence tests are not inherently biased against anybody, really, that intelligence tests do predict real world things that most people are concerned about, and that human intelligence is an extremely important phenomenon about being human that can be understood, at least in part, on a scientific basis. It's not easy. It's a complicated construct, very difficult to come up with ways to assess it. There is no direct way to assess intelligence. They're all basically estimates at this time. Nonetheless, those estimates, the assessments that lead to those estimates, can be used for a number of scientific studies, everything from brain imaging to genetics, to organizational psychology, to management. A lot of practical real world things depend on intelligence.
This is very interesting what you just said, because basically if you speak about intelligence, and I speak a lot about intelligence, so there are two very inflammatory subjects. One is IQ and race, and IQ and difference in cognitive differences between the sexes. So you say basically those are two very inflammatory subject, but nonetheless, they are like a fraction of what intelligence research really encapsulates, yes?
Less so for sex differences. 15 years ago, you would be correct to put sex differences and race differences together as both inflammatory. It's much less, it's much easier to talk about differences between men and women now, because research has shown that those differences, when they exist at all, are very small and essentially inconsequential. And what's interesting, however, with some brain imaging studies do show that when men and women are equated on IQ tests, for example, so they have the same average IQ, they might solve problems with different parts of the brain. This is still an open question. The early research was suggestive of this, but those sample sizes were very small and need to be replicated. Some of the newer studies with bigger sample sizes do not find brain differences between men and women while they're solving problems, but other studies do. So it's still an open question. There's hardly any practical implication of finding those differences right now. What will be interesting if we come up with better ways to treat stroke and brain disorders.
And Alzheimer.
Like Alzheimer's, that might affect men and women in general with different pathways and different sequences of events. So it's very important to know these things because they might lead to better diagnosis and possibly better treatments for brain illnesses if it turns out sex differences are important. So I hardly get any real negative feedback when I talk to the public about male-female differences. The one area on sex differences that's still an issue is when you look at the normal distribution of IQ, the means for men and women are essentially the same. There might be a tiny difference, it's subject to debate, but they're essentially the same, except out on the extreme end for mathematical ability. For mathematical ability, there seem to be more men than women at the extreme high end. There are women at the extreme high end.
And there are more men than women on the extreme left. So basically the curve is like more flat. Therefore, we will see more men in the extremes. And this is part of what Ted Hill theory was, that we tend to go to the extreme. The male want to go to the extreme, and we see it throughout all the animal kingdom. And this was like something that Darwin always already noticed, that the male tend to be more extremist in almost any feature, yes?
That's generally correct. There are more men at the low end of IQ and more men at the high end. But there are women at both ends too. If you think about when you get to extreme mathematical ability, extremely good, there are plenty of women who are extremely good. And the average man on math is the same as the average woman, pretty much. It's really how many people are at the extreme. And there seems to be an advantage for men, which might explain why there are more men in mathematics and engineering and other vocations that require mathematical ability. That does not mean, however, that women can't do it.
No, of course. No, it's because I write it a lot in my book, but let me just fuse together two theories. We have Helmut Nyborg theory, which says basically the same thing, is that IQ for men and women is basically equal because we thought in the beginning that it was equal. So any question that leaned toward one sex was omitted from the original test. This is also Arthur Jensen idea in his book. But intelligence is positively correlated with brain size, and men's brain size is bigger than women's brain size, even controlling for body weight. So if it is actually so, we should expect that men average IQ will be slightly higher than women average IQ. Now, this slightly can be 3 points, 2 points, 4 points. Nevertheless, it doesn't matter on the center, but it's tremendously important on the right left. So even if you don't change the variance of the normal distribution, even if you just shift the men normal distribution 3 points to the right in the extreme end, 150, we will see much, much more men. What do you think about this theory?
This is the position that a lot of people take, and the data seems to support that. But it gets so complex because of social roles and whether or not women have the same opportunities early on. It's a very complex problem. And so for most IQ researchers are not interested in that. Educators, people interested in the disparity between men and women in the workplace, they're more interested in that kind of data. But as far as the intelligence research community goes, men and women are essentially equal. Whether or not one group has an advantage over the other group for certain highly specific mental abilities, it could be true that women have some verbal advantage over men at the high end. But again, this is a tiny part. And that's the male-female differences become much less controversial. The average group differences among races has always been controversial. It always will be controversial. And I'm not sure there's any new data on this. What's new is genetic and DNA data trying to tie psychometric scores to DNA-defined groups. And we're still at a very early stage of that. That only becomes important at some point if you want to predict IQ from DNA, then you might have to have a different kind of prediction, a different equation for different groups. What all this means on any practical level is not so clear. What you hope is on a molecular level, at some point, all these very intricate and complex and convoluted biochemical relationships from genes to behavior can be disentangled in some way to really tell us about the neural basis of intelligence or the neuroscience basis of intelligence. We're a long way from that, but there is movement in that direction.
But part of Steve Schu's research, if I get it correctly, is that I can predict your IQ by screening the DNA of embryos, and this is part of the goal. And if you can achieve this, you can screen not for just man, a boy, or a girl in an IVF, but also can choose or pick the most intelligent embryo and put it back. So now it is still science fiction, or we are heading towards this goal?
It's not quite as simple as you said, because whatever genes might exist that contribute to higher intelligence might also contribute to negative consequences. So at this point, nobody really knows. You can do some prediction just based on DNA, particularly for embryos that might have a higher probability of mental retardation at the lower end. That's how most of this data is used now. Theoretically, it can be used to pick at the higher end, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's only you're only increasing the probability. And right now, you're not increasing the probability all that much. Again, it's one of these complicated social things, but there's an awful lot of good discussion about it among various aspects of the public. So at some point, if the science gets there, people will know about it and can make some decisions about how every country every society wants to think about or regulate that.
Yes, but maybe if the US won't regulate it, so rich people will fly to China and do whatever they want to do there. So it's, again, a very complex issue indeed. So I couldn't agree more. So with your permission, since those two topics are, no, since the sex differences is like a sub part of intelligence, I want, with your permission, to go to see the big picture. Now, in your book, you mentioned several definitions to intelligence. One of my favorite, and you said one of your favorites, is intelligence is what you're using when you don't know what to do. So it's a great definition. Less complex than Lynda Gottfredson, but nonetheless, it's a great, wow, this is intelligence. Oh, okay. So my question to you is, intelligence is basically a measure of how smart you are, and there is like a pain in the butt in this notion, because we have savants, idiot savants, and idiot savants are like, how can it be? How Kim Peek can be with intelligence of 85 or 87? How we can see tremendously gifted in tremendously cognitive gifted people, but however they are not intelligent. So how do you, after 40 years in intelligence research, can explain the phenomenon of savants?
I don't know.
Next question.
There are really two questions. The first question is, how do they do it? And the second question is, why can't I do that?
Yeah.
And the way I talk about this basically is with the concept of G, or general intelligence. And most intelligence tests measure this general ability to reason and problem solve. It's not a specific, it's not limited to a specific cognitive domain like musical ability or mathematical ability. It's the general ability that underlies all other mental abilities. And that's what intelligence tests tend to measure. So it's a general ability. And there you have the diagram of.
I came prepared.
So G is a big part of an IQ score, but there are other aspects of intelligence other than G. There are other factors of visual spatial ability, numerical ability. There are these specific mental abilities, and savants are very unusual, very rare, and very unusual people who seem to excel at certain specific mental abilities, but have little, if any, of the general ability. And often they literally cannot take care of themselves. They need caregivers. They can't learn to tie their shoes. They just cannot maintain themselves. Yet they can do things like play the piano in any style after hearing a piece of music just once. They can tell you what day of the week any date in history was, or what that day of the week would be on any date in the future. This calendar calculating ability.
And Daniel Tammet, for example, can feel pi, can feel the number pi. It doesn't just remember the number pi. We have seen experiments when someone just shift one digit and he became irritated. He became angry. So he can feel like a pattern in an unpatterned irrational number, which is beyond how can he do it? And again, so basically, I think that this diagram is extremely important. So we have mental abilities, and this encapsulates everything: music and day of the week and like rote knowledge, everything. And intelligence, if I quote you, is the part of mental abilities that related to everyday activities.
Not necessarily everyday activity, but general activities, general ability.
And IQ it's the good predictor of intelligence, and the G is the good predictor of IQ. So a G is like the general factor which considered to be more genetic, more biological. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So again, we don't know how does it happen, or how is it possible that we have like Daniel Tammet or Kim Peek, but no matter what they're doing something else than normal 2-digit multiplication that we do like an intelligent test. Yes?
We don't even know. I mean, there have been experiments with real savants to try to figure out cognitively what they're doing. And there's been some brain imaging of savants. The problem is they're so rare, it's hard to generalize from these studies. They definitely are doing something different. The brains seem to be wired a little differently. But how you get from different wiring in the brain or different functional activity in the brain to the amazing abilities they have, who knows? But again, I'm a little more interested in why can't I do it? I would like to be able to do that. You know, Einstein couldn't do those things.
Einstein couldn't solve a Thomas Edison IQ test, so.
Well, it wasn't something to solve. It was just general information that not everybody would have.
Okay, so from that, there is a wonderful quote in your book, and that goes like this. I hope that I get it right. That even if intelligence is 100% environmental, it is also 100% biological. So could you please elaborate on this? Because I think that the nature versus nature is like an extremely important thing. And one section of your book is also called Nature More Than Nurture. So what do you mean by that? Even if intelligence is 100% environment, it is also 100% in your brain?
Well, everything about intelligence comes from the brain. It's the way you think. Now, it could be that if you are raised in a terrible environment, this will affect your thinking, but it affects the thinking by affecting the brain. And somehow that has to be a biological mechanism. So that if you grow up in very limited, with very limited stimulation, that affects your brain, which will then affect possibly the way you think. So one of the interesting things about studies of language acquisition is that if infants are not exposed to the sound of a language in the first several months of life, when they're ready to speak, they won't be able to learn their own language that well. This is why when you learn a second language or a third language, if you've never been exposed to the sounds of that language as an infant, you will tend to speak with an accent because the brain has not formulated itself. The brain has not.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, so many people understand, many people like myself have no facility to learn other languages. I've studied several languages. I have a tremendously hard time, especially with the pronunciation. And I think that's because one reason is my developing brain was not exposed to those sounds. There's no doubt that things that happen in the environment, environmental stimulation, affects the developing brain. But that's a biological process. And that's what I mean when I say intelligence has to be 100% biological, even if that biology was influenced by non-biological factors. So when you talk about genetics, genetics is biology. If something is genetic, like intelligence has some genetic component, we know this is true. Therefore, it must have some biology component because that's how genes work. That doesn't mean that you can't influence that biological mechanism by external things that happen in the environment. That's where this concept of epigenetics comes in, trying to understand the interaction between gene products and gene function and environment. And this is extremely complex to disentangle. There are many people who work in genetics who say it's so complex that it can never be disentangled.
So again, epigenetics, because I think many people think that epigenetics is like the magical word, or like the magic answer for many of the issues, of the hot issues that we are facing. So basically, you said in your book and in your great lectures that people usually were afraid of the word genetics because they felt that genetics mean that you cannot change it. So if like a crime tendency is genetics, or Alzheimer, or schizophrenia, for example, is genetics, so there is absolutely nothing that you can do to change it. And one of the researchers you quoted that when this research was shown, he just fainted because, wow. So, but nowadays we don't say it like this. We basically say, listen, we have the genetics, but what decides whether a specific gene will activate its function or not can be the environment, or the external environment. So this is basically the role epigenetics play. Epigenetics is like the environment that decides which of the switches to turn on and off. Would you say
epigenetics, you said right, it's a magical word. People think it has some explanatory power. It doesn't have any explanatory power. It's an idea. It's a hypothesis. But and it's a very general hypothesis that somehow the environment influences some specific genes that has some kind of result way downstream when you get to intelligence. But understanding all the cascade of events and steps among those things, this is a real challenge. But you're right that it's a magical word. So far, it doesn't explain anything. There are no examples, as far as I know, of specific environmental stimuli that affect specific genes to produce some outcome. And ironically, you can't even do that research until you have the genes. You got to know the genes, and then you can see what range of environmental stimuli affect the genes and then the range of outcomes. So there's a
this is a nice touch regarding epigenetics, because in order to utilize epigenetics, you must use the genes, and then you must say, basically it is genetics. So if we want to escape the genetic path, we can't escape to the epigenetics, because it just will force us to go back to search for specific genes that control intelligence.
Yes, so that for a long time, the predominant thinking is that people have lower IQs because they weren't stimulated in some way as children. So if that's true, if you provide children with more stimulation, they will be more intelligent, they'll be smarter. That's why we have preschool education, things like Head Start. All that started because of the belief that more stimulation in childhood would lead to higher intelligence scores. And so far that hasn't been true.
Let me just quote Russell Barkley, because he just said that we provide much more children's stimulation than what we need. So he basically says, I read it from Hebrew, so I will translate. The idea is that if a little bit is good, so a lot should be better, doesn't apply it. Every child is born with more than 500 physical or psychological attributes that will come out as long as he will get older. And the connection between those attributes and what we can do as parents is very limited. A child is not a blank slate. So basically, Russell Barkley said, listen, we supply much more stimulation the bare minimum. So it doesn't go, so there is like a peak in the curve. It's like if I don't feed you enough, you want to reach your highest potential height. But if I will feed you more, you will just be fatter.
Yes. So most parents want the best for their children. They want that to reach their maximum potential, but that maximum potential may be limited by factors beyond the control of parents. And by the way, most parents of two or more children know this.
Yes.
Because they can see the siblings grow up in the same environment, and often they have vastly different cognitive abilities. And
let me just give you like a fact that many people, that some people explains using in environment. We know that the oldest child in the family is usually have a higher IQ. And we also know that twins tend to have lower IQ compared to their siblings. Now, if environment or language does play a significant role, we can say that the firstborn child only hears his parents, and he hears a sophisticated language. But the second-born child also hears his older brother or older sister, and then he also hears like a very simple language. And this can be the reason why the oldest is like has more intelligence on average than the second?
Well, these are this is one of many hypotheses. And the key thing about hypothesis is that it has to be testable. And what you just said is a testable hypothesis. I don't know the data on this. There's a lot of data on firstborns, and my understanding of that literature, it's been a while since I looked at it, but the differences are not really very dramatic.
Okay, so with your permission, because this is what you said, I proposed this, and you said something that struck me in a recent interview, that you said, don't fall in love with your theories. And one of the theory was the brain efficiency theory, which is a great theory. So before we get into what happened 3 years ago in a conference in Germany, could you please explain what the brain efficiency theory is?
Well, in 1988, I was lucky enough to have access to some of the earliest brain imaging. It was called positron emission tomography. This was about a dozen years before MRI scans. And this picture that you're showing became a very widely distributed figure. The two images on the right are mostly greenish, and they are showing brain activity in a person with very high IQ.
He's solved 33 Raven questions or Raven matrices.
Yeah. So that's an IQ test and a good G test. And those two images on the right are from the same person. It's kind of an upper slice and a mid-level slice. And you have the same two slices on the left from a different person who had a much lower score. And it's mostly red. And the reds, the scaling colors in this picture are that the red and the yellow show the highest activity. This is measured as glucose metabolic rate. And so the person on the left with the score of 11, their brain is actually much more active while they're solving the intelligence test problems than the person on the right. And this finding from this little study, which was the first of its kind, led us to speculate that intelligence was more related to how efficiently your brain was working rather than how hard your brain was working. Prior to this study, there was an assumption among researchers that smart people, their brains would just work harder. This showed the opposite. And so this idea of brain efficiency being related to intelligence became quite a popular hypothesis and has been now tested in many, many brain imaging studies.
And it is very, just excuse me, and it is very logical, because if you have like two cars, one is like Tesla X and the other is Fiat Punto, and they are both tried to climb a mountain, the Tesla will walk less hard, and the Fiat Punto will, because the engine is better with the Tesla. So it is very, it is a logical theory that makes sense. But
well, you know, I hear that a lot. Before we actually saw that data, most people didn't believe that, though. Most people believe the harder the brain worked, the more intelligent. So that early study got a lot of attention. That image you showed got a lot of attention. And now, let's see, here we are, what, 32 years later, 33 years later. And there have been a lot of studies of the brain efficiency hypothesis. And I heard a summary of this at a conference in Edinburgh, Scotland, by a group from Germany who've done a lot of interesting brain imaging work. And by the way, brain imaging studies have become extremely sophisticated. What I did in 1988 is literally laughable by today's standards.
8 people, 25,000 for a scan.
Yes, yes. And I'm very aware of that, but it was it generated a hypothesis. And the summary I heard at this conference of all the subsequent data basically concluded the evidence for the brain efficiency hypothesis was not very strong. And the person giving this, Professor Baston, I was sitting right down front, and I know this woman. She's a very lovely woman, and so the question and answer period came, and I put up my hand, and she kind of called on me, wondering what I was going to say. And I said, you know, you're probably wondering what I think when I sit here and I hear that this hypothesis that we generated, 30 years ago, doesn't seem to be correct. And I think it's terrific. It was a testable hypothesis. You and many others have now tested it. It's led to all kinds of much more sophisticated information. We now have brain connectivity efficiency and different kinds of efficiency, and it's fabulous. And so I was very delighted to hear this talk, because you don't fall in love with your theories. They're testable. And most intelligence researchers take this feeling. They're not out to prove that something is right. They're out to figure out what is true in nature. But
now you think that the brain efficiency theory is not correct according to the latest data?
It's still, in my mind, it's an open question. There are studies that are consistent with it, other studies that are inconsistent with it. It's such a general concept. What do you mean by efficiency exactly? And could efficiency be
less brain activity? For example, less brain activity, as we saw in the image in the fMRI. You can measure brain activity using like a fMRI and blood in the fMRI. So if you have less brain activity, so the brain works slower or in a more efficient way, no?
Well, it could be much more complicated. So for example, there might be a dozen brain areas that are used to work on a problem. And you're going back and forth. It's not just 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, they're just all talking to each other.
Parallel computing.
That some people only need 8 brain areas to solve the problem. It might take the same amount of time. It might take the same amount of energy, but fewer circuits, fewer areas. So, and the brain connectivity studies that are now possible, that were not possible in 1988, these studies are now exploring these different hypotheses about where in the brain efficiency might be and how efficiency might be achieved. And they're doing much larger samples. And so I think the jury is still out exactly on whether brain efficiency has something to do with individual differences in intelligence.
So I want to go back to what you just said. Don't fall in love with your theories, and again, make empirical hypothesis. Just again.
Hypothesis.
Hypothesis, yes. Again, I didn't say it. Okay, make your own guess. But when I started reading about IQ research, I was like, I didn't know anything, and then I started with the bell curve, and then your book and Ariel Hunt and McIntosh and basically everything that I could lay my hand on, and then I started to see that I'm leaning toward the nature thing, the genetics. And then I said, I must read another thing. And then I read Richard Nisbett. And from what I understand, if I have like two figures, Richard Nisbett and Richard Lynn or Arthur Jensen, for example, it seems that Arthur Jensen and Richard Lynn were obsessed with empirical data, with empirical testing, where Richard Nisbett, a great scholar as he is, didn't provide empirical data for his theories. And I can see it again and again and again. We have like the genetics versus the environment, but Richard Lynn and Arthur Jensen, they went across the world and tested people from different cultures. And Richard Nisbett just said, listen, it doesn't feel right, basically. Or Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond in Papua New Guinea didn't test the native there with an IQ test. He just said, they are very smart. So how do you feel regarding this environmental thing basically supply almost none evidence?
I think you've summarized it well.
Thank you.
Look, you can critique the empirical data. That's fair. Some of the critics depend on cherry picking alternative studies. It's much more complicated than that. And there seems to be, there are fair critics, and then there are critics who set out to destroy the concept of intelligence. They just want they just want to explain away differences. They want everyone to have equal outcomes. That's what they do. But, if you look at the empirical data, you'll get a different impression. And it's not enough to say, look, these studies are flawed, therefore the opposite must be true. These studies are flawed, so you do better studies, or you have to do studies, on the environment. Well, it's hard to measure the environment. Well, yes, and it's hard to measure intelligence, but intelligence researchers have figured out ways to do it. And people who want to, there's no real measure of environmental similarity. So you want to know if two households have similar environments? How do you do that?
Yeah, it is very.
And if you can't do that, how do you test hypotheses about the importance of the environment?
I would even
know the environment is true. We know the environment has influence because genetic studies can only explain so much by genetics. The rest has to be environment. But there's also an interaction, and there's also random events, by the way. The brain develops from genetic instructions impacted by environmental influences in the context of random events, random developmental events. So all these things together, it's a complex picture. So just talking about nature versus nurture doesn't get you that far. You have to figure out how those things interact, and you have to start with the genetics, I think, because you can measure that.
I would even say that I think that Professor Nisbett is digging his own hole, because basically his theory is that IQ of 70 for below Sahara Africans is impossible. You just say it can't be done. It can't be true, because 70 in IQ of 70 in the US means that you are almost totally retarded. And then he concludes that the IQ of the sub-Saharan Africans must be higher. But in speculating this theory, he said, let's say that it's higher as one standard deviation upper, which is 85. But if sub-Saharan Africans have 85 IQ and people and the Black community in the US has also 85, so basically environment plays no role, because you can't imagine two more different environments than New York and sub-Saharan Africa. So in a way, saying that sub-Saharan Africans cannot have an 70, an average score of 70, in a way emphasizes and strengthens the genetic theory of IQ. What do you think?
Well, that's one way to look at it. This is not my area of specialty, but if you believe that culture determines IQ more than anything else, you just have to show it. What aspects of culture? And if you have a group that has a lower average test result, I'm not going to call it intelligence, I'm going to call it a test result. What is it about the culture, about that culture, that leads to the lower score? These are things that people have to answer if that's the theory they want to test.
But I can tell you,
people are not interested in testing. They're interested in stating, as you point out. So, you know, if you write a book on how to be more intelligent, somewhere in the book there should be very practical things about how you be intelligent. Just saying things like eat a good diet,
sleep well,
exercise,
breastfeed yourself.
You know, oh, that doesn't work, by the way. That data turns out not to be true.
Yes?
Yeah. So bigger studies showed that those early studies just weren't correct. So yeah, there's really a lot of criticism. Some of it is constructive, much of it is more political.
And I would say I spoke with Garrett Jones, and he said, I don't understand this at all, because you have two options. One is say IQ is mostly genetics, and two is say IQ is mostly culture. And what do you think we will be able to solve first, the genetics part or the culture part? We don't even know how to approach culture. So we should favor the genetics, because in genetics, we at least have a route to solve something. We know how to approach genetic problems with medicine, with etc. But if the IQ differences between the Jewish community in the US and the Hispanic community in the US are totally environment, as James Flynn stated, that's the Jewish mother versus the Black mother who wishes that her son will be in the sport team. So how do you approach it? So we should favor something that we can fix.
Yeah, I don't know, but that's what the people who want to test ideas about culture have to figure out.
Now, I had Joe Heinrich on the show 2 weeks ago, and he just wrote a wonderful book about why the West became so popular, the weirdest people in the world. And he's like a student of Jared Diamond. And then I asked him some of the intelligence questions that I'm addressing you. And he actually believes that if you take a newborn, twins is not a good, a newborn from Papua New Guinea and place him in New York, he will have like the same amount of he will reach to the same level of IQ. So he will reach to the same level of IQ in the US. So basically, if we think that James Flynn theory is correct and people in the West developed something that, we are leaning towards the abstraction and the scientific, it should be presented in our brain circuits. So basically, he also is like, I think that he's very afraid as being part of Harvard University to say, listen, it is not pure environment.
Well, let's talk about you for a minute. Explain to me what environment you missed as a child, so today you are not a theoretical physicist.
No, just a second. But I can't explain you this, but just a second, I can explain you why many girls in Israel were pushed away, and especially in the religious community, and I'm part of the religious community, were pushed away from the science because their teacher, the female teachers, encouraged them to don't pursue a career. So basically, I can say that that you can have an environment that can push you away from your full potential. Yes, I can.
No question about that. Everybody, I think, understands that. What intelligence researchers can contribute is the data to show that there are women who are very capable who don't get a chance, and they should get a chance. That's the social outcome of knowing the data. Now, if your social or cultural environment says otherwise, that basically says we don't care, or we don't think that's true, we don't think women can do that, that's another issue. That has nothing to do with intelligence research. But intelligence research, all of this psychometric research, all this testing research, it all speaks to the idea that every individual has to be treated as an individual, not as a member of a group. You don't know just because someone is a female or a male whether they're going to be a mathematician. You can't.
Yes, but most people, but again, okay, I'm totally agree. But most people are not Ramanujan, who just invented the all math in a small village in India. If you don't have like a physics class in a school, even if you are extremely intelligent and extremely smart, you are in a way pushed away from being a theoretical physicist. No
question. But I was making a different point. Did you have any early experience as a child can you imagine having a different early experience as a child that would have led you to become a theoretical physicist?
Since I have a PhD in electrical engineering, I know that I'm not smart enough to have a PhD in theoretical physics. I know, because I live in the academia, in the exact sciences, that there are people who are much, much more smarter and intelligent than I. And basically, there is nothing that I can do in order to become like, I can read papers and say, wow, this is like, it is beyond my capacity even to understand it. Yes.
So you have insight. One way to say this is that you have some insight into your cognitive limits.
Yes, and this is very, very stressful, because most of my neighbors consider me to be the smartest one in the neighborhood. But however, I can be, because I'm speaking with you, I speak with Joe Heinrich, I speak with the most intelligent people from all around the world, and I can see the gap, and I can see that there is nothing I can do about this gap. I was just born like this.
Well, that's kind of the point. So if someone believes you can take any individual, doesn't matter if they're from a different culture, you can take any individual from the same culture and raise them with all the stimulation, all the role models all the advantages you can think of, and they're still average. What do you conclude from that?
I think I couldn't agree more. And again, the best evidence is someone with more than one child. If you have two children, there is very little you can do in order to steer one child in the direction of the second child. It just doesn't work. So again, but it's not what it wasn't my question. My question is after 100 years of the scientific revolution, what James Flynn said, that we are leaning toward the abstraction right now, is our brain as an infant born in Tel Aviv or in New York is wired differently as an infant than the brain of the people in Papua New Guinea?
It might be wired differently in some ways, but it's something to test. It's something to test, and this is why it could be wired differently for DNA reasons or from stimulation reasons. This is why, as they collect DNA samples from around the world and do brain imaging on people from around the world, you begin to get some data on this complex interaction. So that's the direction it's moving. It would be, what I wanted to say was, it would be awfully nice if all the differences among people were due to different environments by chance, so that if you have programs to correct those environmental differences, the behavioral differences or the cognitive differences would disappear or become minimal. And that's what's been, in the United States, we've been doing that for 50 or 60 years with early childhood education, and it doesn't seem to have an impact on mental abilities. It has other impacts that seem to be positive. And it's a good thing to do. I'm not against doing it because it seems to be helpful in other areas, but it doesn't raise
study skills, for example. This is one thing that you said, that all those programs acquire or give you as a child, like study habits, which are extremely important later on in your life, but it doesn't increase your intelligence. So we can do the Head Start, which is a 1 trillion, I don't know how many, 1 trillion program, but eventually we won't see any difference whatsoever. Although James Flynn also stated that the IQ gap was reduced to, I think, 12 points or something like this. So
yeah, and that all that is good, but I want to think about the next level. I want to think about understanding the non-environmental aspects, because those are the ones that I think can be manipulated to really make a big difference. So that if you have somebody with an IQ of 85 and you can get them to 95 or 100, that's going to make an enormous difference in that person's life.
Enormous difference in personal life and enormous difference in society. Now, with your permission, I would like to move on to the next, to the last two questions. One is like a big one, but it is important. There is a chapter in your course, which is the brain in milliseconds. Basically, you expose us to the theory of ECT, elementary cognitive task, where I ask you to do very, very simple, not cognitively demanding at all tasks, but I time how fast you can do it. And the faster you can do it is the more intelligent you are. And this is extremely interesting, because then you can say there is no cultural difference whatsoever, because I just time you on a millisecond basis. Yes? And this was Arthur Jensen's idea from his latest book, Clocking the Mind.
Yes, it certainly minimizes cultural things. If people would argue that if you have a lot of experience that Western people have with making decisions like that, you'll be faster on such a test. I don't know if that's true, but the fundamental idea is that you can measure brain processing speed in milliseconds, and milliseconds is an absolute number. You could have 0 and 100 milliseconds is twice as slow as 50 milliseconds. Whereas IQ points are on a different kind of scale. They're on an interval scale. And that's what's holding intelligence testing or intelligence research back somewhat, is that there's no absolute measure. So Jensen proposed that brain processing speed measured in milliseconds might be a better measure, that people who solve problems faster might be have a cognitive advantage. And when he says faster, he's talking about how fast you can press a button when a light flash comes on, or when multiple light flashes come on, you're supposed to pick the one that's furthest away. There's a little bit of cognition there, but the speed with which you can react to this, he thought might be an alternative measure of intelligence. Nobody is working on this now. It turns out to be a very complex problem. If you could have, it has to be a computer generated thing. And because of differences in computer speeds and things, it turns out to be a hard problem. As far as I know, no one's working on coming up with an intelligence test based on reaction time.
This is very strange. I started, I'm involved in a startup that we wish to change Bender motoric test for children with something that involves artificial intelligence. And one of the things that we are doing is like this tests of like very simple ECT test, and we time it according to, and we time it. So right now I'm working on this, but again, many people say that you cannot, that every computer uses a different set of times and a different times, so you cannot measure it. But I don't think that this is a real problem, because our modern computers times things in nanoseconds. So
yes, no, there are ways to solve this problem. I just don't know that anybody is working on it to make it to test several thousand people on reaction time tests and then correlate that to psychometric scores. People have tried this. I was part of this back in the year 2000, but it just hasn't gone anywhere.
And this will be a very, very fast intelligent test, because you're just, I'm just going to time you for like 5 minutes on different tasks, and then I will know your IQ. Now, again, from what I read, the correlation or the current correlation between those tests and IQ tests are probably is 0.5. So they're not very, very correlated. They're mediocre.
That's correct. Now, it might get better if you have the right task.
Yes.
Or the right battery of tasks. It would be better to have a battery of tasks, maybe 5 or 6 tests, each one lasting 30 or 50 seconds.
And you think that what drove Arthur Jensen into this field was the critique that he got from his G factor? So he said, listen, I will give you an IQ test that will have no cultural bias whatsoever.
Well, no, he understood. I mean, I knew Jensen, and I've talked with him about this very issue. He understood that for intelligence research to become a natural science, it needed a measure that was on a ratio scale. And he thought that would be reaction time. And he thought if you could come up with a battery of tests where reaction time was the measure rather than the number of correct answers, that this would substitute for intelligence tests. He thought the whole word, he thought even the word intelligence had become so controversial that he preferred brain processing speed. And that's the book you mentioned, his last book on clocking the mind. For anyone who's interested in this kind of lays out all the issues.
Yes, it is a great book. So again, it's It is very strange because I think that you said that there are, even in ECT, even in those cognitive, very elementary tasks, you can see race biases, because like some ethnic groups have like a shorter reaction time and shorter and higher and longer decision times. And even in this non-cultural test at all, you see that there are that there are gaps or the differences between different ethnic groups, and you cannot blame culture. If one group has like a higher reaction time and the other group has a higher decision time, what does it mean? What does it encapsulate?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for good research in that area, and I hope someone does it, especially if they can do it on a handheld device like a phone. That would be awesome.
And the last question, with your permission, in your book, I think that, just a second, let me just quote it because it is extremely funny. In the Matrix, the Holy Grail, can neuroscience boost intelligence? So let me just read one of your quotes. Is neuroscience can boost intelligence? And one of your quote is, I know Kung Fu. So, which is Neo in the Matrix, that he just got all this Kung Fu material inside his head. So again, we know the limitless IQ pill that was like strike us all. And he said, wow, can we have an anti-Z pill? Can we be like this mouse who is smarter? Can we, what do I need to do? Do I need to listen to Mozart all day? There is, please give us a subscription to be smarter.
Well, let me put it this way. If I knew any, I'd be doing them. And I don't do anything different after all my 40 years of doing research in this area. The only thing with my kids, I didn't restrict their computer game playing. I didn't think that would hurt them. If anything, I thought it might help, especially when they were young. There was hand-eye
Just a second. Ishai, you can play how much you want, how many times you want. Okay, please keep going.
But for myself, I don't. There are no tips. I mean, I talk in the book about, magazine writers are always calling me. They want tips to raise your IQ. There are no tips. What research can do is understand the neurobiological basis of intelligence and maybe figure out ways to have the brain wired a little differently during development. I think there's potential for understanding how to manipulate brain systems that could make people smarter, at least on average. But that's really the holy grail. That's where all intelligence research is going.
Marry the right people, marry the right spouse.
That's the one thing, that's the one practical thing to increase the probability is, to have children with the smartest person you can find that will allow you to, that wants to marry you.
I think that this is part of the Jewish or the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, where we see the smartest people in many philosophers are singles with no kids. We have Spinoza, Descartes, Immanuel Kant, Schopenhauer, etc. And the model of the smartest person in the Jewish community is what we call the Talmid Chacham, the rabbi, and the rabbi is usually marrying the daughter of the richest people in the village. Therefore, they can have as many kids as they want. So basically, what you're saying right now is like a Judaism, what Jewish were practicing for many, many, many years, and this is some people say that this is part of what led to the 15 points in Ashkenazi Jew, Would you
Well,
agree?
what you're saying is, what you're doing is giving an example of a cultural aspect that influences the genetics.
Yes, definitely.
So, could be, I don't know. There's a lot to figure out. I think when I started 40 years ago, the question was, is there a genetic component to intelligence or not?
And now we are asking if there is an environmental component to intelligence or not.
Well, now we're asking about specific genes. How do, what is this gene function, and how might that lead to some brain mechanism that leads to being more intelligent? So we've come a long way.
Okay, now I have like the last question. You are about to publish a new textbook, The Science of Human Intelligence, covering the latest research in the field, with a tribute to Errol Hunt in the cover I saw. Now, what has been updated since the publication of the Neuroscience of Intelligence? This was published in 2017.
2011. 2011.
And
What most of the updates are on the chapter on genetics, completely rewritten, and there's now a whole chapter on brain imaging, which is completely new. So there's an update. Those are really the main updates.
No, but just a second, but the Neuroscience of Intelligence, in your book, you mentioned the Finn research, which was conducted in 2015. So how come the Neuroscience of Intelligence was published in 2011?
The
first
I'm
edition?
sorry, maybe I misunderstood. My book was published in the end of 2016, 2017.
Oh.
Earl Hunt's book was published in 2000.
No. What has been updated? No, again, I'm sorry. What has been updated since the Neuroscience of Intelligence to
I see.
the Science of Human Intelligence?
Yes. Well, it's the same answer, basically. My book in 2017, The Neuroscience of Intelligence, ended with the Finn study, which had just come out, which is the first study of brain connectivity and intelligence. I thought it was a fabulous study.
Could you please elaborate on this study? Because study states that basically your brain, the wiring of your brain is like a fingerprint, and I can see, and it's like just a fingerprint. Yes. And so how does it relate to intelligence?
Well, that the way brain areas are functionally related to each other is a stable relationship. And it's so stable, it's like a fingerprint. You can look at a person's brain connectivity and identify that person. It's unique to that person. Moreover, individual differences in those connectivity patterns are related to psychometric IQ scores. And that was a phenomenal study. The question at the time was, can it be replicated? And now it can be replicated. And it's those connectivity studies based on brain imaging are getting more sophisticated.
So again, the connectivity studies, connectivity means the wiring between different parts of the brain. Yes?
Yeah. Yes. And it can be the actual wiring, which is structural connectivity, or it can be functional connectivity about how those brain areas work with each other. And that's the most fascinating advance. And we go into that in great detail in the new book, which is not out yet.
Okay, but it will be out. So Professor Richard Heyer, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. You are like a personal hero of mine after 40 years. One of your professors was, I forgot his name, Coleman? No, what was the name of your professor that was like the big guru in the IQ community? The professor who remembered every IQ or SAT score of his students.
Oh yes, Professor Julian Stanley.
Julian Stanley. Oh.
Yes, when I was in graduate school at Hopkins, and he did some very famous studies of mathematically precocious kids. Yes, and I write about him in the book. He was
so you are a personal hero. I want to thank you personally for getting me into this fascinating world of intelligence and IQ and neuroscience of intelligence. Thank you so much. With your permission, since our YouTube channel is also dealing with productivity, do you have like a single productivity tip, how to become in your life, in your academic life, more productive?
You have to be persistent.
Oh.
Persistence is the most important thing in academia.
And this is from the man who studied IQ for over 40 years, and the first race and the one of the first to ever conduct a brain imaging study involving IQ and intelligence. So Professor Aiyer, thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure, a genuine pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm happy to have the opportunity, and keep up with your keeping up with intelligence research. It's going to get even better.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.